The hatchery manager looked embarrassed. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other like a man about to confess something he'd rather keep to himself. I hate asking this. Caleb Hale smiled. Go ahead. The manager pointed toward a stack of wooden trays sitting in the corner of the loading dock. 320 turkey eggs, perfectly clean, perfectly intact, perfectly unsellable. Caleb frowned. Why, they're too old for our commercial customers. The manager sighed. Chain hatcheries have strict rules. If eggs aren't set within a certain number of days, they get discarded. No exceptions, no second chances. Caleb stared at the trays. So these become waste, usually. How much? The manager smiled weakly. If you haul them away, they're free. Two workers standing nearby exchanged amused glances. One whispered to the other, nobody's hatching those. The second laughed, they'll end up feeding pigs. Caleb looked back at the manager. I'll take all of them. The workers stopped laughing. Nathan arrived 20 minutes later with a livestock trailer. When he saw the towering stack, he blinked twice. That's a lot of eggs. 320. So what's the plan? Caleb carefully secured another tray. We're going to hatch turkeys. Nathan laughed. 320 of them. We'll see how many cooperate. If you love stories about ordinary people turning what others throw away into something extraordinary, subscribe and join us. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's see how 320 discarded eggs changed one man's farm forever. The Hale farm had never been about poultry. For nearly 30 years, the family raised sheep, goats, and a few heritage chickens. Turkeys were nothing more than a Thanksgiving curiosity, something people ate, not something people believed in. But Caleb had always admired them, not because they were flashy, because they were surprisingly hardy, and because of something his grandfather Samuel once said that nobody else believed. The old turkey breeds are better workers than people give them credit for. When Caleb was 12, he watched a flock of heritage turkeys wander through an apple orchard. They didn't damage a thing. They hunted. Grasshoppers, beetles, ticks, all day long without stopping. Samuel smiled. Most people only see dinner. Caleb looked up. What do you see? Farmhands. Those two words disappeared for years. Then they came back at exactly the right moment. The farm had suffered through 2 brutal summers, grasshopper outbreaks that stripped pastures bare, tick infestations that tormented the livestock, feed costs climbing with no end in sight. The land was struggling. Caleb was struggling. And he wondered if the answer had been walking around farms for centuries while nobody bothered to notice. Back home, Caleb converted the old brooder barn. Every incubator he owned came out of storage. Friends loaned him 2 more. Temperature, humidity, turning schedules, nothing could be rushed. One wrong degree and everything dies. Nathan watched him labeling trays with the precision of a man who had already decided this would work. You've got charts, Caleb smiled. I always have charts. The veterinarian stopped by that week, looked through the incubator window for a long time without speaking. That's ambitious. You know, hatch rates could be low. I know. The eggs are older than normal. I know. Still trying. Absolutely. Every morning began the same way. Check temperatures, record humidity, turn eggs, candle each tray one by one. Some showed nothing, darkness, stillness. Others revealed tiny embryos growing inside fragile shells, life where everyone else had already declared there was none. Day after day, more eggs stayed viable than anyone expected. Something was happening inside those shells, something quiet, something patient, something nobody had given permission to begin. The hatchery manager called one afternoon. Just curious, Caleb answered. We're getting development. Silence. A long one. Seriously, I honestly didn't expect that. Neither had anyone else. But news travels fast in farming towns, especially the kind people laugh at. One Saturday morning, Dale Harper sat in the diner drinking coffee. Rick walked in grinning. You hear about Caleb? He's trying to hatch 320 discarded turkey eggs. The room erupted. Another rancher shook his head. Probably free for a reason, Dale smiled. I suppose we'll find out. Caleb entered moments later carrying fencing supplies. The room went quiet just long enough to be obvious, just long enough to sting. Dale grinned. How are your imaginary turkeys? Caleb didn't flinch. They're still eggs. Laughter filled the room again. Caleb paid for his supplies and left without another word. He had more important things to do than explain himself to people who weren't paying attention. 26 days later, the first egg cracked. Nathan nearly spilled his coffee racing toward the incubator. It's happening. Caleb was already there. A tiny beak tapped carefully through the shell. One small crack, then another, then silence, then another tap. Hours later, a damp little poult stumbled into the brooder, healthy, alert, hungry. Caleb smiled. One. Nathan laughed. Only 319 to go. The hatch continued through the next 3 days. Not every egg survived. Caleb expected that. Some shells never opened. Some embryos had stopped weeks ago, but far more hatched than anyone predicted. Far more than anyone thought possible. Tiny bronze poults filled the brooders. Peeping echoed through the barn from sunrise until long after dark. The sound of life where there was supposed to be none. Nathan finished counting late Sunday evening. He walked into the farmhouse carrying the notebook. His hands were shaking. 237 healthy poults. Silence. That's over 70%. Nathan nodded slowly. Better than some commercial batches. The hatchery manager drove to the farm himself the next morning. He stood quietly watching hundreds of healthy poults exploring their brooders. Finally, he shook his head. I threw away the best hatch I've seen this month. Caleb smiled. They just needed a chance. The poults grew astonishingly fast. Within weeks, they followed Caleb everywhere like a bronze army with no commander. Unlike commercial breeds, these heritage turkeys flew onto fence rails, perched in trees, and explored every corner of the farm like they owned it, because in a way they did. Then, something nobody expected happened. The grasshopper population around the sheep pastures started disappearing. Nathan noticed first. You seeing this? Hundreds of young turkeys moved through the grass like a slow-moving wave. Every few seconds, one snapped up another insect. Grasshoppers, beetles, ticks, anything that moved. The sheep grazed peacefully behind them as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The veterinarian returned during midsummer vaccinations. He watched the birds work for several minutes, then quietly laughed. I forgot how good heritage turkeys are. They're cleaning everything. By late summer, neighboring farmers started asking questions nobody could answer. Why were Caleb's pastures greener? Why did his sheep seem unbothered by flies? Why were there fewer grasshoppers near his fields? Nobody connected the answer to 320 discarded eggs. Then, the county agricultural extension agent showed up unannounced. He spent nearly an hour walking the farm in complete silence. Finally, he stopped beside Caleb. Exactly how many insects do you think those turkeys are eating every single day? The extension agent returned several times over the next month. Not because he doubted what he saw, because he wanted proof no one could argue with. He placed insect traps across several pastures. One held only sheep, another held sheep and the growing turkey flock. Every week, he collected samples. Every week, the numbers told the same story. Grasshopper populations dropped dramatically where the turkeys worked. Tick counts fell, fly larvae became harder to find, the sheep grazed more comfortably, the pastures recovered faster. The agent closed his notebook. This is remarkable. Caleb shrugged. They're just being turkeys. The agent smiled. Exactly. That autumn, feed prices climbed again. Farmers across the county complained. But Caleb noticed something others missed. His heritage turkeys spent most of the day foraging on their own seeds, acorns, berries, insects. They still received feed every evening, but consumed far less purchased grain than commercial birds. Nathan checked the records. We're using almost 40% less feed than expected. Caleb looked across the pasture. Grandpa was right. Nathan smiled. He usually was. One Saturday morning, the diner sounded different. Dale Harper folded his newspaper. You hear about Caleb's turkeys. The extension office measured the insect populations. They're way down. The room grew quiet. Nobody laughed this time. Caleb walked in. Dale smiled. I owe those turkeys an apology. Caleb laughed. They probably won't notice. Winter arrived gently. The pastures entered dormancy healthier than anyone remembered. The veterinarian compared records with previous seasons. Your sheep required fewer parasite treatments this year. He pointed toward the bronze turkeys scratching through old grass. I don't think that's a coincidence. The hatchery manager visited shortly before Thanksgiving. He hadn't seen the birds since they were tiny poults. Now, magnificent heritage bronze turkeys roamed the hills. Their feathers shimmered copper bronze, emerald, and purple in the afternoon sunlight. He stood speechless. I gave these away. His voice cracked. I almost threw away an entire breeding flock. Caleb smiled. They simply needed time. The hatchery manager came back with an idea that would change more than one farm. We still discard older fertile eggs every season. He paused. What if we offered them to small farms first instead of throwing them away? Caleb extended his hand. I think that's the best idea you've had. The following spring, the hatchery launched a surplus egg program. Discarded fertile eggs no longer went into waste bins. Small family farms could collect them at minimal cost. Hundreds of eggs found homes instead of landfills. Several beginning farmers started heritage flocks they otherwise could never have afforded. The local newspaper noticed. Its front page read, "From Waste to Working Farms." The story spread throughout the region. Agricultural colleges invited Caleb to speak. Not about incubators, not about turkeys, about seeing opportunity where everyone else sees disposal. During one presentation, a young farmer raised his hand. "What made you believe those eggs would hatch?" Caleb smiled. "I didn't. I believed they deserved the chance. I knew some would fail." He paused. "But I also knew they would all fail if nobody tried." The room went silent. Then it applauded. By the second summer, the original flock had matured completely. Hens nested beneath hedgerows. Natural reproduction began. Nathan counted 43 wild nests. Caleb laughed. "They've decided they like living here." A neighboring orchard owner heard about the turkeys. His apples were getting destroyed by insects. Caleb agreed to try. Dozens of turkeys moved through the orchard for weeks, cleaning the floor, consuming insects, clearing larvae from the soil. The following spring, the owner called. "I've sprayed less than ever." Word spread again. Vineyards, berry farms, nut growers, all asking the same question. One evening, Dale Harper leaned against the pasture fence, watching the flock drift toward the roosting trees. The setting sun turned every feather brilliant copper, the kind of beauty that makes a man stop talking and just look. "You know what still bothers me?" Dale said quietly. "I called them garbage eggs." "You did." "They weren't." He shook his head. "They were opportunities." Caleb nodded. "They always were." The hatchery manager joined them. He watched hundreds of heritage turkeys disappear into the evening woods. "I've worked around poultry for 35 years, and I almost missed the best flock I ever produced." Caleb looked toward the birds. "They produced themselves. I simply gave them the opportunity." As darkness settled over the farm, Caleb remembered Samuel's favorite lesson. The old man used to say it while gathering windfall apples after storms. "The farm wastes very little. Nature usually finishes what people abandon." Months earlier, 320 turkey eggs sat forgotten in a hatchery corner. Workers saw expired inventory, a disposal problem, something no longer worth the shelf space. Caleb saw possibility wrapped inside fragile shells, not certainty, not guaranteed success, only possibility. 237 poults hatched. They didn't merely become beautiful birds. They restored pastures, reduced insects, helped sheep thrive, inspired new programs, created breeding stock other farmers sought, and reminded an entire community that value isn't determined by how quickly something sells. Sometimes the greatest harvest begins with whatever everyone else has already decided to throw away. By the time the original flock filled the hills with shimmering bronze feathers, nobody remembered laughing at the discarded eggs. They only remembered the farm that proved discarded opportunities sometimes hatch into the strongest future of all.